I didn't know how, and I was also afraid of men.
Really?
Oh yeah, I was afraid of men, yes.
The news didn't break, it whispered. The kind of whisper that travels quietly through screens, through living rooms, through hearts that suddenly forget how to beat. Diane Keaton is gone. For a moment, it felt like the world had paused. The noise of everything, headlines, traffic, deadlines faded, and what remained was this heavy, fragile silence, the kind that follows loss you don't yet know how to accept. Hollywood's skyline, usually burning with artificial light, seemed dimmer that night. The city that had once made her its muse suddenly felt hollow, as if the laughter, the charm, the warmth she brought to its golden screens had taken something essential with her. On October 11th, 2025, inside the quiet of her California home, Diane Keaton, the woman who had redefined honesty and heartbreak, took her final breath. And in that moment, something larger than life slipped quietly into eternity. When the world found out, there wasn't outrage or spectacle, just stillness. The kind of stillness that feels sacred. Because how do you even begin to say goodbye to someone who made you feel less alone in your own skin? She wasn't just a movie star. She was an era. For more than 50 years, Diane Keaton wasn't acting, she was translating the human condition. The fear, the longing, the humor that hides pain, the awkward ways people love each other, she made it all visible. Through The Godfather, through Annie Hall, through 1,000 small, unforgettable moments, she became the heartbeat of a golden generation of cinema. She didn't fit into Hollywood's box of glamour and perfection, and thank God for that. Diane made being imperfect look divine. She was quirky, unpredictable, brave, and unapologetically herself. That was her rebellion. That was her magic. But behind that radiant smile and those whimsical hats was a woman carrying invisible weight. Because the truth is, Diane Keaton's life was built not just on triumph, but on the quiet pain she never stopped feeling, the solitude behind the laughter, the heartbreaks behind the applause. For years, she had a way of hiding the ache behind her wit, turning loneliness into humor and pain into art. The world saw a free spirit. Few saw the woman who spent nights wondering if freedom was just another kind of isolation, and yet she never let the darkness define her. She danced with it. She used it. Every wound became a line of poetry in her performance. Every fear became another reason to stay vulnerable, to keep reaching toward the light. Now, time, that merciless writer, has written her final act. The credits are rolling, and the applause has turned to tears. But what remains isn't just her filmography. It's something more intimate, a legacy that can't be measured in awards or reviews, but in the way she made people feel. Because Diane Keaton taught us that it's okay to be different. That being uncertain doesn't mean being weak. That love, even when it breaks you, is still worth chasing. She showed us that beauty isn't in perfection, it's in the tremble, in the hesitation, in the laugh that arrives 1 second too late. And maybe that's why losing her feels so personal. Because she didn't just exist on our screens, she existed in our reflections. Her laughter used to echo through decades, through generations, reminding us that the most powerful stories aren't about heroes, but about humans who keep showing up even when life feels impossible. Now that laughter has quieted. It drifts somewhere between memory and eternity, and the silence she leaves behind. It's not empty. It's heavy with gratitude, with love, with the ache of knowing there will never be another quite like her. Before we go any further, if Diane ever made you laugh when you needed it, if she ever made you feel understood when you thought no one could let this moment be your way of saying thank you, tap the like button as a final tribute, not for clicks, but for remembrance. And write R.I.P. Diane Keaton in the comments below, not as text, but as a candle lit in her honor, a light we send forward into forever. Because before there was the legend, before the laughter, the fame, the icon, there was a little girl growing up under the hot sun of Los Angeles, trying to understand love through silence. And to understand Diane Keaton, truly understand her, we have to go back to where it all began. Everyone thought this was the final act of a love story that had been waiting 20 years for its ending. And for Diane, it truly felt like destiny finally remembering her name. She believed that after all those years of waiting, the story was ready to end, not in silence, but in forever. One evening in Rome, as the sun melted into gold and the air turned the color of memory, she finally said the words she had rehearsed in her heart for 2 decades. Her voice trembled not with anger, but with surrender. "Marriage or goodbye?" she asked, barely louder than a whisper. It wasn't a demand. It was the quiet plea of a woman who had waited too long to be chosen. The table between them was a small battlefield of unfinished wine and untouched bread, the remains of an evening that could have been eternity. "I can't live in the in-between anymore," she said softly. Outside, the olive trees stood still, their silver leaves holding their breath. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled once one long, mournful note that seemed to echo the final beat of something sacred. He looked at her, then away. No outburst, no argument, just that unbearable stillness of a man who had already chosen silence over truth. That silence became his answer. She would later say, "He didn't have to say no, the silence said it for him." And in that instant, something in her bright, stubborn, endlessly hopeful broke. That night, she packed quietly, folded her dreams between clothes that smelled faintly of wine and regret. Before dawn, she stood at the villa window watching the horizon bruise into light. The city didn't mourn with her. Rome carried on indifferent. She didn't cry. She simply left. When the plane lifted, the city unfolded beneath her like a painting she could never step into again. The seat beside her was empty, and had always been empty, and now it always would be. Days later, the phone rang. Her father had collapsed. A brain tumor, they said. While she was mourning one love, she began losing another. 2 heartbreaks arriving hand in hand stripped her bare. "I broke," she said years later. Not loudly, just quietly broke. Hospitals replaced the sunsets. Airports blurred into waiting rooms. The smell of antiseptic clung to everything. Machines hummed with a kind of false mercy. And in the sterile quiet of those white rooms, she held her father's hand, the same hand that once steadied her on the way to school, and whispered, "Don't go yet, Dad. I'm not ready." But death never waits for readiness. He had been her compass. The one person who never asked her to be smaller, easier, softer. He waited outside auditions with a newspaper, ready to drive her home, win or lose. "Next time, kiddo," he'd smile. And somehow, those 3 words had always been enough to make the world bearable again. Losing him was like watching the last light go out in the house. For weeks afterward, the lamp on his desk stayed lit, as if even the electricity refused to believe he was gone. She would walk into his study at night, touch the worn wood and whisper, "I'm trying. Dad, I really am." But the silence that answered back was the kind that changes a person forever. The months that followed were heavy and colorless. The laughter that once filled her home went missing. Friends called, but she didn't answer. She would make tea every morning and forget to drink it. Every night she left a lamp on, just in case grief ever decided to leave. In therapy, she sat week after week, unspooling years of silence, trying to understand how someone so full of light could feel so lost. "I kept asking him to love me the way I loved him," she confessed once, her voice trembling even after decades. But love doesn't always echo back. It was a cruel realization that some people love by leaving, that sometimes the greatest cruelty is not rejection, but the silence that follows it. And yet from that silence, something began to shift, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The same stillness that had once destroyed her became the space where she finally started to breathe again. She stopped waiting for someone to choose her and began the quiet work of choosing herself. Not with fanfare or revelation, but with small, stubborn acts of living, painting, writing, laughing again, even when it hurts. She learned that healing doesn't come with music playing in the background. It comes in the slow return of appetite, in the soft acceptance that the world keeps moving, and so must you. She never married, never sought another grand romance. "I guess I was waiting," she said softly once. But I didn't know for what. Maybe what she was waiting for was herself. Through art, through work, through fragments of beauty she found along the way. She began to build something new. Not a love story, but a life. She learned to live without the noise of expectation. There was peace in solitude, but also a certain ache, the kind that lingers even after healing. Friends would sometimes ask if she ever regretted walking away, and she'd smile in that wistful, knowing way. No, she'd say, if I hadn't left, I never would have found what waited after. What waited was not another man, but the quiet miracle of becoming whole again. Acting had once been her escape. Now it became her anchor. Each role gave her fragments of herself back, a laugh, a glance, a strength she'd forgotten she possessed. In the faces of the women she portrayed, she found her own reflection, bruised, resilient, endlessly searching. And then came motherhood, not through blood, but through the hearts she gathered along the way. Nieces, godchildren, the young artists she mentored all found in her a kind of fierce tenderness. She called them my kids, and they called her the same. They said she loved them with a patience that felt like sunlight after a long storm. She grew older, but she never faded. Time softened her edges without dulling her light. Her laughter was still sudden and infectious, the kind that could turn a quiet room warm. Yet when the nights grew long and the house fell silent, she sometimes sat by the window with a cup of tea, the moon her only companion. People often mistook her calm for loneliness, but she would tell them gently, "There's a difference between being alone and being at peace." Still, there were moments when memory returned not to wound, but to visit. She would catch a glimpse of a familiar smile in a stranger or hear a song that once belonged to Rome, and her breath would catch. The years had turned the pain into something almost beautiful, a bruise she no longer wished away. In her later years, she moved to a small cottage by the sea. There, the air smelled of salt and rain, and every morning began with gulls tracing the horizon. She painted small, quiet things, hands, light, the edges of clouds. "I think I'm finally learning how to see," she said once. The neighbors adored her, the woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 untold stories. Children would stop by with shells and questions about the world, and she'd tell them, "The trick is to keep wondering. The day you stop, you start to disappear." When her health began to fail, she didn't speak of fear. She only asked that the curtains be left open so she could watch the sea change colors. Each day she sat by the window as if waiting for a friend. Some mornings she'd hum soft fragments of an old song she once danced to beneath the Roman dusk. On her final day, the ocean was calm. The light slipped gently across the room, brushing her face in gold. A friend found her sitting there, a small smile resting on her lips, eyes open toward the horizon. There was no note, no grand farewell, only the stillness of a woman who had finally made peace with her story. They buried her near the cliffs, where the wind carries whispers from the waves. Sometimes visitors swear they hear laughter on the breeze, soft, familiar, like the echo of a memory refusing to fade. And maybe that's how it should be. Not an ending, but a continuation of a life that began in longing and ended in quiet grace. Diane had once said, "I wanted a love that would last forever. I just didn't know it would be my own." In the end, she got her forever not in someone else's arms, but in the endless sky above the sea she loved.